Hey, welcome to the second episode of the Beach Diver Scuba Gear Maintenance Clinic. And we have a lot of fun offering this clinic 2 or 3 times a year. It's very well attended, very well received. What we basically do is cover the things that you should be doing with your scuba gear to make sure that it's going to function reliably and last a long time. We don't go into items of overhaul and serious in-depth maintenance that should be handled by a qualified and trained technician. But we cover the things that really aren't covered in open water training. In open water training, essentially we show you how to rinse off your gear, how to dry it, store it, keep it safe, keep it from being damaged. But we don't go into some of the things that can correct some minor problems and basically keep your dive going. Sometimes save a dive, and sometimes save you a trip to the shop. In our first episode, we covered tools and supplies, and we simply looked at a bunch of tools and equipment that you should have on hand. A lot of that stuff is stuff you have around the house already, or in your toolbox, or on your tool bench. They're easily acquired items. You can get them at hardware stores, scuba shops. You don't really need to order them online because there's not a whole lot of specialty tools that we use. You can order those, and when you do, great, you'll have them available. Your friends will want to borrow them. They're not cheap. But most of the maintenance that we talk about is stuff that you can handle with things that you have laying around the house. We talked about toothbrushes and toothpaste. We talked about rags and cleaners and solutions and solvents and soaps and so on. So today we're going to talk about the regulator. Now, next to the air cylinder contains that breathing gas that's going to keep you alive. But the regulator is what delivers that gas to you. It's your life support system. You want to take as good a care of it as you possibly can. You want to get this regulator serviced on a regular basis. If you're just diving a couple of times a year, that basis by most manufacturer recommendations is once a year. If you're diving much more than that, you might want to consider having it serviced more often. What's much more than that? Well, we in the beach diving community here are often in the water 6 to 7 times a week. So if you just back that down to a conservative 5 times a week, that's 250 dives a year. That's a lot. Most dive tables are predicated on a diver maybe doing between 50 and 75 dives a year. That's far more than the average scuba diver does. So you might want to have a backup reg or a second set that you can depend on as you put your rig into the shop maybe every 6 months, just to make sure that it's going to function properly. That's a lot of use, and you get corrosion, you get salt buildup, you get all kinds of things. We're going to show you some tricks and some steps that you can go through that will keep that corrosion, that buildup to a minimum. That'll make sure that your regulator is going to work properly as often as you use it. Certainly dealing with the first step that should be taken care of is a good rinsing. So I'll step away here in a moment and I'll show you the proper way to rinse a regulator, the way that the manufacturer really wants you to do it. Alright, so the absolute best way, the manufacturer recommended way for you to rinse your regulator after a dive is to first hook it up to compressed air, to a compressed air source, to your cylinder. It doesn't matter if your cylinder is full or not. You should have at least 500 psi after your dive anyway, right? So there, it's hooked up. I've turned it on. Get a little O-ring leak right there, but I'm not worried about that. I can shift out that O-ring later. Mostly I'm looking to have positive air pressure on there. Now I'm going to rinse it out. So giving the entire regulator a surface rinsing, I'm going to go ahead and fill this. I'm going to have water flowing through here, rinsing out the salt, rinsing out any sediment that might have gotten inside. Through the front of it, trying to give it a chance if there's anything in there to allow it just to drain out like that. Keeping the running water going through there. Getting a good thorough rinse. There's not going to be any salt, any sedimentation in there. Now the reason to have it hooked up to compressed air is that if for some reason this valve is pushed, if it was pushed without there being compressed air and positive air pressure, then water could go through that valve and get back in here. Now it's not going to cause a whole lot of damage, but it will cause some type of corrosion in there if it's going to be a frequent occurrence, or, God forbid, if it gets up and backs up into your first stage. You don't want to have water sitting in that first stage under any conditions. So you really want to avoid that, and the best way to avoid it is to hook it up to your compressed air cylinder, rinse it out very well, blow it out a couple of times. Just want to get it dry. Do that to both regulators. Do that to your console. Get that water inside there. Flush out the sand and the silt that gets in there. When I service these, I find that there's sand all packed inside, the breathing hole back inside there, so you want to flush it out as well as you possibly can. People say, well, you know, how do you get the sand in there? Does it come through diving and so on? No, sand can come in different ways. There's sand suspended in the water column sometimes. So you don't have to be a beach diver that gets sugar cookied or rolled in the sand or drop your rig in the sand in order for sand to get in here. It could just happen on a dive. So rinse it off all over. Rinse off inside. Get that Schrader valve cleaned out. And then when you're finished, depressurize it. Disconnect it. Make sure that there's no water that's going to get into that first stage. Put your dust cap back on. Cinch it down. Now I will often towel dry this before I put it into my carrying bag. So I'll towel dry it off, make sure it's nice and dry. Then I'll put it into my bag. I never put it into a waterproof or an airtight bag because there's still going to be moisture in here. And if I put it into an airtight bag, it's not going to have a chance to dry out. And the next time I go to use it, I'm going to taste mildew, because that's what happens when you let something that's wet get stored in the dark, warm place. Its life is going to begin. So that's the most preferred method of cleaning your rig and rinsing it after a dive. Second would be, if you don't have access to compressed air, but you do have your hose, go ahead and rinse it out as best you can. Try to keep the first stage above the others. That way, if you do get water inside this part, it won't get up into the first stage. If you're doing it like this, that would probably happen. So keep the first stage above that. One easy way to do that, to keep that first stage above the others, is simply place it behind your neck. Then rinse these out like that. Get them nice and clean. And then go ahead and rinse your first stage. Okay, that's the second most preferred. The least preferred, but sometimes the one that we have to resort to sometimes, is simply putting it in a dunk tank and soaking it. Okay, if you do that, the chances are high that somehow sitting in a dunk tank, you're going to lay this purge button down. It's going to press the valve, and water is going to flow up through the second stage and into the hose and possibly get into the first stage. But if you have no other way of cleaning the salt off of your regulator, go ahead and rinse it. When I do that, I keep it rolled up like this. I'll dunk it in there, I'll swish it around, I'll make sure the purge valves are not closed, I'll rinse it real good, and then I'll bring it out and I'll shake the water out at the second stages. I don't want water sitting inside there because, like I said, mold and mildew can form if you're going to leave that regulator set for a while and there's moisture inside. Okay? So that's the best 3 ways to go ahead and rinse this after a dive. Okay, so welcome back. You've seen how to properly rinse and dry and then store your regulator. Now let's talk about how to make sure that your regulator is going to function properly all the time. Before you start a dive, you should be looking at your rig anyway. You want to look at it, you want to check the hoses, make sure there's no cracking. You particularly want to check up around where the hose junctions are. You're looking for cracking or splitting. This one's just starting. It's not a real serious issue. This is the high pressure hose, and there are certain things you look for and that you'll find when a high pressure hose starts to fail. But I'm looking for any cracking around here, any separation. These hose protectors I left on here for a purpose to show you. Now, can you look inside and see if there's any cracking? You can't. In fact, you can try as you might. You might be able to get one back off like this, but even doing that, you're stressing the hose a little bit. The purpose of these hose protectors is to keep there a minimum of stress, or to reduce the amount of stress on that joint there. But at the same time, you still can't, most of the time, get inside and take a look and see what's going on. You're looking for stress and cracks and splits in here. You're looking for corrosion buildup on the metal parts themselves. This one will not come off, so I wanted to show you that. What will happen when this hose starts to fail is bubbles will start to come out of this sleeve. And you probably won't notice it, but your buddy will. He'll point back behind you, and later you can check it, and you'll find out that as you're immersed, bubbles are slowly coming out of here. And that either means that the fitting, the hose itself is splitting here, or the fitting is start to break apart. Simply means you need to replace your hose. No, you can't wrap electrical tape around it. There's nothing that you can put on there that's going to be a suitable fix. On the low pressure hoses, you're talking about 150 psi. Most tape's not going to handle that. And on your high pressure hose, you're talking about 3,000 psi, and there's nothing that's going to be a quick fix for that. So you give it the once over, you take a look at the metal parts. You're looking for corrosion, you're looking for buildup. You might want to loosen the yoke screw if you've got a yoke. If you've got a din, it's going to be a different matter. You want to look inside, see if there's any buildup and corrosion on this one. This one's needing some service now. There's a little bit of corrosion you can see around that collar. It's not serious. I certainly wouldn't call a dive on account of that, but I do know that when I service this rig, I'm going to clean that up. I don't see any cracks or deep scratches or gouges or anything like that. I'll look at the second stages in addition to the entire hose. So one of the first things that you want to check on your second stage is this mouthpiece. You want to take a look and see if it's torn or worn. You've certainly had those dives before where you've gone ahead and put the mouthpiece in your mouth and then notice that this grip inside is ripped off, and then you spend the entire dive struggling to keep that mouthpiece in your mouth. It's much easier if before the dive you notice that it's cracked to go ahead and change it out. Some divers I know just go back to the shop and they pay them to do it. It's so much easier just to carry a spare with you. They only cost $4 or $5 most of the time. You can take some shears, clip off that tie, it pulls right off, and then the mouthpiece itself comes right off. Okay? Now, it might be that I don't want to change this because it's cracked. It might be fine, but I might want one that's a different size or different style. There's a certain style I prefer, and I'll put that on here. If I've got one that has what I don't want to use that particular day, I'll just clip it off. I'll take the one I want. I'll install it right on there. Make sure it's well seated. Then I'll take a new tie. Place that around, tighten it up. Now make sure it's lined up. I'll cinch it down and I'll trim it up. There we go. Just as good as it was before. So I'll look at it, make sure that there's nothing that's built up inside. I had somebody had brought one over to me the other day, and I asked him, well, you know, I'll take a good look at it. Is there anything you know that's wrong with it? He says, well, I think it's full of spiders. And sure enough, it was. So I'm not quite sure where it had been stored. I think maybe out in the garage. But yeah, spiders had built a pretty good system of webs inside there. And they had the spider balls in there. I guess it's that's their food or something like that. And that had to be cleaned out. That's not a surprise you want when you put your rig together and start your dive and take a big deep breath and get a bunch of cobwebs and dead spiders in your mouth. I had one the other day that somebody brought in, and I just shook it like that, and sand just kept pouring out. I would say a half a cup of sand, dry sand, just poured right out. Now before, it was probably wet sand because they got sugar cookied coming in from a dive or something like that, and they just couldn't rinse it all out. And it's just as well they brought it to me because they didn't know what to do anyway. But here's what you can do. You can take it to the shop, of course, but here's what you can do. Some regulators, it's very easy to take off this front guard right here. There's different ways that they're affixed. Many of them are screwed on, some clamp on. You're going to have to find out which way that yours goes on there. These two I've got an Aqualung, I've got an Apex. Sometimes you can just loosen it and it'll screw right off. There's a special tool that you can buy for Aqualung, and it goes into these holes. It aligns with those holes. You turn it, it grips it, and it unscrews it. I didn't feel like buying one of those for $25, so I made one. And this particular specialty tool will work for several different manufacturer styles. I simply measured where the holes are in different ones and placed these nails through there, and the nails will line up with these little holes, and that allows me to unscrew it. So I can put those in. Let's try with these two. Put those in like this, twist it, and off it comes. Some shops and some technicians and even some instructors will say, don't try this at home. Well, most of you are going to be working with your gear anyway. You might as well know how this works. I would invest in an exploded diagram just in case you take it apart and you can't remember how it goes back together. If you don't have an exploded diagram, use your cell phone with the camera. Take a picture each time you take a piece off, and then lay the pieces in an orderly fashion so you can remember in what order they go back in. So I've got the cover off. I'm going to set it right there. Inside is a little retainer that serves to buffet the cover and the diaphragm. I've got the diaphragm next. Okay, so it's just a silicone rubber diaphragm. Sometimes they have a little hard plate here. And that hard plate serves to activate this valve. As you inhale, it's going to pull this valve in ever so slightly, and that's what's going to open up and supply the air to you to breathe. And then when you stop inhaling, it springs back open and closes the valve. So now that I've got this off, I can look inside for sand or dust or dirt or spiders, and I can see if anything needs to be removed. My preferred means of removing stuff from in there is compressed air. So I'll get my compressed air gun and I'll simply blow out what I can. And then I'll take a soft brush. A toothbrush works fine. This is a nylon brush, similar to a toothbrush, a little bit stiffer. I'm going inside. I'm getting in those threads. There's some sand in there, a little bit of grit. Cleaning that out. Otherwise, it's mostly clean in there, and it's looking pretty good. Before I reassemble it, I'm going to look at the parts. I'm going to inspect this diaphragm for wear or tears. If it's worn or got a tear, it won't provide the suction, or the suction won't allow it to compress effectively against that valve, and so it will be breathing erratically. If you pull one out and you notice that it's got some, it looks like bite marks around the side, that's probably exactly what it is. Cockroaches have been known to feed, they just love silicone rubber for some reason. And so they'll chew on that, and if you've been keeping your regulator outside, if it's been stored in the garage, most likely that's what's been getting after it. You probably won't be able to order a replacement part. You can go to some shops and buy one, or you can get them to order it for you. And there are some places online that you can. If you've got a much older regulator, good luck with that. If it's no longer being supported by the manufacturer, you're probably not going to find the diaphragm. But chances are, if it's within 10 to 15 years, you're going to find a replacement diaphragm. If yours looks fine, make sure that it's clean before you put it back together. There's also another step that I like to do for silicone parts. So mask skirts, fins, other silicone parts. I learned this 40 years ago in the Navy. The way we used to keep our gear fresh and functional, and believe me, we had to because it was really difficult to get replacement parts. We would take something like Armor All. Okay, whatever's in here acts as a good protectant for silicone. And I'll simply apply that on there, rub it in, so whereas this was looking nice and dull before, once I wipe off the excess, this is oftentimes it's the same stuff you put on the dashboard in your car or on your tires, so your tires look brand new. And there you go. It's nice and black, it's supple, it's protected against aging, at least until the next time you service it. So it's nice and clean. I dry it off so that there's no excess on there, and I reinstall it in my regulator. Again, in case I forgot which part goes in next, I'm going to take a look at my exploded diagram, or I'm going to look on my phone at the pictures and see that this was the last item taken off, so it's the first item to go back on. This retainer, sometimes it's just a washer, a wide washer that goes on there. This one's just a little bit more complicated than that. I wipe the sand and the dirt off of it and install it. I just make sure it slips into place. Anytime you've got plastic parts and you have to force them, you're doing something wrong. It's out of place, it's misthreaded, something like that. You should never force plastic parts together. I take the cover, take a look at it, brush out some of the sand that's in the threads. Now, I've heard it said, some people will put a little bit of silicone grease on there. Yes, it will allow it a little bit of lubrication as you put it back together, go on a little bit easier. But also having grease in an area that's going to be exposed to sand and silt, it's going to collect that sand and silt, and eventually it might make it difficult to get back off. So I wouldn't put the silicone on these threads, especially since they're plastic. You don't need lubricant anyway. So just put it into place, and with 2 fingers, start to screw it down. Now, if it's difficult to screw, it's probably misthreaded. Don't force it. Back it off. Go in the reverse direction, 2 fingers very gently until you feel the threads just slip in, just like that. And then go forward with it. Okay, and I can go through it. I'm watching it, it's screwing all the way in. I just cinch it up. It doesn't have to be tight. And I never retighten it with this tool. Finger tight is plenty good enough for this. It's going to keep everything in place, and it's going to function just fine later. This particular regulator will work just the same way. I will look at the fitting here. There's something else that I'll do on mine. You can try it on yours. If you feel uncomfortable taking this step, that's fine. But this is a step that I'll use if I'm going to adjust the valve inside. Sometimes I'll do it if I notice this octo in particular, it's starting just to bubble a little bit, not completely free-flowing, but just bubbles coming out. I know that the valve in there needs a tiny adjustment. So I'll take my wrenches, and the best way to open these is to use 2 wrenches. That way you're not putting undue pressure against either of the fittings. Just like that. It unscrews. Now, most of the time when you unscrew this one, it's going to be a little hard because invariably there's going to be some corrosion that gets in there. Okay, it's exposed to salt water, you who are saltwater divers, and salt water just, it corrodes metal. It's going to happen. I'll look inside here. If I've been experiencing some bubbles coming out of this fitting, there's a little O-ring that I can take out, and that would be the subject of a further episode. But that O-ring can come out and be replaced with another O-ring, lubricate it, put it back in, and I'm good to go. I'll look inside, and I'll look for any corrosion. I don't know if you can see that. I hope you can. But the valve seat is in there. Some of them take a hexagonal Allen wrench to adjust. This one takes a flat screwdriver, but rather than use a screwdriver, I'm going to use the adjusting tool on this mini tool here. This mini multi-tool. It's hollow ground, so it's not going to scar up that valve face. And if I need to make any adjustments at all, I make them very gently, and I only do it a quarter turn at a time. So here I have this in the 12 o'clock position. If I need to make an adjustment, I'll turn it 1/4 turn, and if that takes care of the problem, that's all I need to do. Okay, I do that quarter turn at a time, so I know how many turns I've gone in any direction. If I need to reverse it, I know exactly how far I need to go. Having made the adjustment, making sure everything's clean, I can brush that off. If I'm really concerned about the corrosion, I can take a little bit of vinegar on a Q-tip. I can rub that into that, and you'll actually see it bubble away the corrosion. I keep vinegar on hand. We're talking just white vinegar. Vinegar is an acid. The corrosion on here is an alkali, so acid is going to remove the alkali. The secret to it, though, is you don't want to do it too long. You don't want to have it rest too long, and you want to rinse it off within probably 3 to 5 minutes. And then rinse it off with water. I'll usually soak it in simple green, which makes a great solution. I put it in a bathtub like this. Okay, you wonder, what am I going to do with all those old mask tubs? Well, this is one purpose for that. So you put a solution, usually 8-to-1, water to simple green. Soak it in there. That'll take care of a lot of the situations you got going on. It'll keep it nice and clean. You can, if you want, put a little bit of silicone on here as you put it back together. I'll take a little bit. Just a little bit. If you put any too much on there, you're just going to collect up dust and dirt. Ease it on. Finger tight as far as you can. And then just snug it up. Doesn't have to be that tight. Just snug, and that's all you need. Okay, so that's good to go. One final check. I'm going to put my dust cap back in here. I'm going to screw that back down. And then I might also take the Armor All and go over these hoses. Okay, again, it's a protectant. It allows rubber to last a little bit longer. And like I said, I've been using that for 45 years since they showed us that in the Navy, and it's always worked real well. Okay, so I'm almost done. The last thing I'm going to do is check my Schrader valve. Okay, so the Schrader valve inside this inflator, this low pressure hose, it's going to go into your VCD inflator. There's a little valve in there, like the valve in your tire, the tube of your tire, the tubeless tire. It's in that valve there. You press it in, it allows the air to flow. You let it off, and the spring puts it back into place and closes the valve. This mini tool has a Schrader valve tool on there, and you can simply insert it, allow it to bite in, and especially if you've been having troubles with your BCD inflator leaking a little bit. Usually if it's this particular valve, your BCD will not be filling up. What you'll see is bubbles coming out of this joint where this connects to the power inflator. And usually once you unscrew it, it'll come out just like that. So that's your Schrader valve. And today I wore a lighter shirt because somebody said, you know, my dark shirt didn't show the parts that well last time. You can see it just like that. This one's relatively new. It's in great condition. An older one would be filled with corrosion because that's just the way it happens. And this little black or sometimes a red plastic washer in there, that will look pretty bad. So I'm looking to see that it's in good shape. It is. I'm not going to have any problems with this one. And so I'll reassemble it. Generally, if I'm not having problems with the Schrader valve, I'm not going to mess with it. But sometimes if I'm doing an overhaul of my gear, I'll take a good careful look at it, and I'll go ahead and I'll just screw it back into position. Again, with most Scuba parts, you don't really need to torque something down. If you have to torque it down, generally you're doing something wrong. This one's going to go in a little bit easier this way. Okay. One final thing that sometimes people like to do, notice this yoke screw. It gets corroded, it's exposed to salt water, it's exposed to the elements. So what you can do every once in a while, particularly if it becomes a problem. Now the problem it's going to cause if it does get corroded is it's going to be difficult to tighten or loosen from time to time. But you can see the mild corrosion that builds up in there. Okay. Again, I can take my brush, which I'm usually going to try that first. Try to brush off what I can. This stuff is coming right off, so I'm not even going to go to the next step. The next step would be a little bit of acid bath or into the vinegar just to get off the top portions of it, and then just soak it into the simple green. Soaking, you can do it a couple of minutes or a couple of hours. Simple green's not going to hurt it, and then rinse it off. I'll take a little bit of grease on this because it's going to be metal to metal. And I'm going to ease it right in there. All right, that's maintaining your regulator. This is not to take the place of your annual service and overhaul. You're going to leave that up to the technicians. Never, ever, unless you're completely a gambler, a foolhardy risk taker, unless you're trained, don't take this first stage apart, please. It's not complicated, I know, and it's easy enough to get it apart. I get that. But getting it back together and getting it back together right, sometimes there's some tricks to it, and you want to make sure it's right. I can tell you this, sometimes you can put a first stage back together and it works just fine here on the surface. But you get down below 50, 60 feet and something can happen to it. So leave that to trained technicians. If you've had the training, God bless you, that's great. You can get the training. Every once in a while manufacturers offer that training and divers can go. It's not cheap. Generally it's about $150, $200 for a basic second stage or first stage course. Takes about 3 to 4 hours, but at least you'll learn how to take care of your own gear. A lot of divers that dive a lot, they do get that training. They make sure that they know their gear, and it's sort of like a parachutist who learns how to pack his own chute. It's your gear, it's your life, it's your life support system, and so it's okay that you're going to do that. But you got to get that training. Make sure you know what you're doing. If not, make sure you've got a properly trained technician taking care of it. Don't just give your gear to your buddy because he has more confidence than you do in taking care of the gear. Give it to somebody who's trained. If you go into a shop, ask who's trained. Most shops aren't going to have somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. Okay, so that's your regulator service. I hope I've helped you with this. Next time we get back together, I think we'll look at tanks next, air cylinders, and right after that, BCDs. Okay, I'm glad that you could join us. I hope that your time ashore, this prolonged surface interval that so many of us are sitting out right now, that it's not too much of a problem to you. And spending your time like this is certainly going to be profitable. Okay, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.